Hello and welcome to the third lesson on digital design within Rhino. This lesson is going to be focusing on the creation of 3D external views within Rhino, how to render these out and also combine these with a Make 2D line drawing in Photoshop, and then start to add texture, animation, people, and add a bit of life into these views as well. So we're really going to be starting from the basic model in Rhino all the way through to the final image in Photoshop. Now, I'm going to be using the model we started making in the last two lessons, but what I've done is I've kind of expanded on this model. I've turned it into this kind of monster here, which is a kind of tab block we're going to be using for this example. And I'm assuming you're kind of all working along with your own work while we're doing this, so all the same principles apply, which we'll cover. Now, before I start doing any kind of work in this view, we really need to make sure that our layers are set up correctly before we start doing anything else and exporting the view out to work on in Photoshop. Now, for external images, or kind of any images you do of your building, internal or external, I make sure that my layers are grouped by colour and by material type. So if I have a certain material on my walls, I'll make that red, and if my internal material is different, I'll make that a different colour. And it's really important that the materials are all kind of labelled in different colours, because this is really important when you bring this into Rhino, into Photoshop, that it's very easy to select if the layers are set up correctly. So you can see here that I've kind of got my floor as a colour, stairs as a colour, windows as a colour. Everything's a different and unique colour there, which is quite important moving forward. Now, I've kind of set up this tab block and I've got these contour lines which I'm actually going to make into a bit of a landscape before we start modelling and exporting our view out. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm just going to use these contour lines and I'm just going to offset them as they would be to kind of create a terrain. I'm going to do this just using the move tool, moving it vertically down, kind of imagining that these are all sort of 1 meter offsets from each other. And we're going to be using what's called the patch tool to help us create a terrain from there. And we're also going to be creating a kind of small lake or pond in front of this building too, just to kind of add a little bit to the image in that respect. So just going to move these down. I'm just going to do these ones by eye. And when you've leveled off your contours, if you've got contours you can do this with, or you can do this with any lines around your building really, we can just use the patch tool. If you just type in patch, and what this does is it creates a terrain over a series of lines you have, and this is really useful for if you're kind of got a building sitting on some landscape, or you've got some contours already and you want to model that into a landscape. All you do is set the contours to the correct levels and then use this tool patch. So if I type it in, now the accuracy of the patch depends on this sort of surface U span and surface V spans here. The higher that number, the more kind of accurate your terrain piece will be, but the longer it's going to take to do. So don't put in a huge number there because it's going to probably break your computer. So I'm going to put mine at 50 by 50 for now, so you can see how it works. And then if I hit OK, you see what that's done is it's kind of moulded a mesh, or a kind of terrain surface, sorry, on top of those contour lines, and it's used the contour lines to help work out where the terrain is. So we've got this kind of dip down here and then our terrain ramping up to our building, which is exactly what I wanted. So that's good. Now what we're going to do is we're going to create a little pond here, and to do that I've got a water layer here, just make it a blue colour, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to use a plane. And I'm just going to draw out a plane surface there, and because our terrain is already modelled, all we have to do is just move that down using the gumball until it kind of sits naturally in that dip we've made in our landscape. So I think I'm kind of happy with it there, and there you have a kind of simple terrain and a piece of water as well, pond or a lake. So I'm kind of happy with that terrain setup, and I think we're going to kind of stop there for any landscaping. Any other kind of vegetation, trees, other bits and pieces I'm actually going to add in Photoshop later down the line, but you could add this in Rhino as well. sort of up to you how much detail you want to add into the landscaping, but for this particular example we're just going to work with quite a simple piece of landscaping in the building, and we're going to be adding a lot more in post-production for that. Now the first thing I want to do when I set up a view is set up the camera and work out the camera angle that we're going to be looking at this building from. So I think for this particular shot I kind of want to set up something that looks down at this level, looking across this kind of lake here up at the building. Now it's really important whenever you're doing perspective views that you do them from a person's eye level, and the reason for this is that obviously any views we see of buildings in reality we're seeing from our own eyes, and if you don't set a camera in a 3D space at eye level it can make all your doors, windows, all the scale of your building look slightly incorrect. So it's important that you set up all your camera views from eye level to make sure that there's no kind of discrepancy and that you can clearly see the scale of the building there. So to do that, what I do is I usually make a box and I'll level this off at a person's height, which is 1.6, 1.7 meters roughly. So once I've done that, I'll move the box into the rough position where I think my person's going to be standing, probably about there. So what that's going to do is I'm going to place my camera at the top of that box looking at the building, and that's going to make sure that my camera, when I place it, is perfectly at eye level. Now for this shot, if I just had this, and to place a camera, if you go to View, Set Camera, now you can go Place Camera and Target. So I can place the camera at the top of the box here, and then I can place the target at the bottom of the building, like so. So that's simply how you place your camera in. Now the problem with what I've just done there is that I actually kind of pointed the camera slightly upwards, and if then I start to change the lens angle of my camera, you'll notice that the building now has these kind of diagonal lines going off and it's not perfectly straight. Now the reason it's not perfectly straight is because I haven't set my target at the same level as my eye level. You have to be looking perfectly horizontally to make sure that your building lines as they go up the building remain perfectly straight. Now to do that, when I set and place my target, we want to make sure the target is on exactly the same level as my camera will be. So I'll usually just make another box, and then all I'm going to do is I'm going to use the gumball to make sure I'm not moving it up at all. Put it below the building, that's probably going to sit below the terrain, yeah. I'll select these two boxes and then I'm going to isolate them, just using the isolate tool here. Then we're going to go View, Set Camera, Place Camera and Target. The reason I'm isolating them is just because I can't see that box otherwise, because it's hidden under the terrain. And we're placing the camera on our camera box and we're placing the target on our target box there. So now we're looking directly at that target box. Then I'm going to show the objects, so we're back, and now we've made sure that our camera is perfectly looking horizontally and therefore all our lines on our building will be straight. Now obviously on this view, the way it's set up, because of my lens length of my camera, I can't see the top of the building. So what you want to do now, you've set up your view, is you might want to kind of change this length. This corresponds to kind of a camera lens would be, and the lower you go, the kind of more wide angle it would be. So let's put it down at 30 and see if we can get the top of the building. There we go. So now we've got the top of that building in, and it might be now you want to kind of tweak your view. You can sometimes use the I don't usually use the rotation, but I'll play around with the lens length until I've got that at a nice level. It might be that you want to kind of pan slightly. Your kind of view might not be quite in the right place. You can rotate it, but because we've set up that initial box to sort of set our height of our camera, it means it's quite easy now to tweak and that we've still got that level on the right level. So what I might do is I might move slightly forward. yeah, it's just a case of kind of tweaking it until you get the view you want, and it might be that you have a couple of stabs at it just to get the angle, but I think for now we'll kind of stay somewhere like that. And when you're happy, what you want to now do is save this view as a named view, and this is really important because if you accidentally kind of rotate or get away from this view, you'll then lose it if you haven't saved the view. So it's really important that you save it as a named view, and to do that, go to View, Set View, and Named Views. And we're just going to do a new view, Save As, and we're going to call this External. External view, and hit OK. And there you go, you can see that it's saved. And what that means now is I can kind of pan out, and we can jump back to it if needs be. So it's locked that view in. So now we've set up our view and we've saved it out as a named view. So we've got all that locked in. Now before I start exporting this out into a view to work in Photoshop and Illustrator, what we're going to do is I'm just having a look at the building here, and the way I've originally modelled these windows is without any glass panes, just because I was kind of doing that so you could see through into the building inside. But for when we start to actually render out the view, it's quite important that we're rendering out those panes of glass and have those as a different material colour, because we'll want to select them later down the line as objects in their own right and kind of add a material and add a reflection to them. So to do that, because we've made this window as a block, and this is just sort of reiterating a previous point on block making and why this is so important, because I've now got over 100 windows in this building, because I've made it as a block, I've kind of got an extra component down here, and we're just going to select one of these windows. I'm going to type in Blockedit again, much like we looked at in the previous session, and we're just going to add a pane of glass to this block. I've got a layer set up called window glass, so all I'm going to do, I'm just going to draw this as a box in the window frame. Like so. And then when you're happy with that, hit OK. And because it's a block, now all my windows have that pane of glass. So just going back to the previous lesson and the points we made there, it's super important to use blocks for things like windows, doors, and any of these components, because it just makes your kind of modelling so much quicker when you can just quickly add a piece of glass and you don't have to go around and add one to every single window in this building now. So now that's ready, I can go back to my named view. Here, we've got the glass. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to export kind of multiple versions of this image. We're going to do a Make 2D, we're going to do a basic capture of this kind of layer, and we're also going to do a rendered version as well. And when we're going to combine all these layers together in Photoshop to make the final image. So the first one of these we're going to do is a basic screen capture, and to do that I'm just going to go, first I'm going to switch my view. I'm on ghosted view at the moment, which is a semi-transparent kind of object view, and we're just going to go on to shaded. And the reason for that is that we kind of want to use this to help pick out key colours in our image. And we don't really want any transparency to affect that. So flick to shaded. Then just in our external view, we're going to go down to capture here, and we're going to go capture to file. So that's got preview of the view we're capturing. And down here asks us for the resolution we want in this. So I'm actually going to set it to a custom resolution. We're going to kind of keep this, we're going to lock it in at the viewport aspect ratio for now to help us, and we're going to set the size, and we're going to set it quite large because we want to match this size with the render size we're doing as well. So I'm actually going to set this to 4000 pixels wide. So for instance, if I was kind of wanting to print anything over the size of A3, maybe A3, A2, 4000 pixels would suffice for that. This is about equivalent to a kind of good DSLR camera resolution. So 4000 pixels wide, 2500 pixels wide. It's quite good to make a note of this number as well, because when we go to render it, we want to match that size in our render, so then when we combine the images together, they perfectly line up. So it's good to kind of make a note of that resolution. Let's go. if you forget it, you can always find the image on file and have a look at the resolution as well there. So once we're done, hit OK, and I'm just going to save that just on my desktop at the moment. So that's the first version we're saving out. The next one we want to do is a make 2D of this file. So I'm just going to select the objects, just type in make 2D. We're going to maintain source layers again and just hit OK with that. Now this one might take a bit of time now because I've got a larger model, so I'm just going to pause while it makes 2D and we'll pick up again when that's done. So that make 2D is now finished, so we can go back and have a look. And then our top view now, we've got the make 2D file. You'll see because my water kind of is just a plane hovering, it actually hasn't made 2D very well because it hasn't got a clearly defined edge. But that's fine because we can use this in combination with our other views. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to set these up on a layout page as well. It might be that you want to do I've got a portrait page here, but it's kind of more, seems more important to do this as a landscape page. And to switch the orientation of a layout page, you might want to just right click and go to landscape there. I'm not going to cover too much on layout pages in this session because we've already covered it in the previous one. So if you kind of want to go back and have a look at how to do that, you can. So I'm just going to roughly, the thing is with the make 2D, we're not going to be able to match the pixel size on this one because we're exporting it as a vector, and therefore it's kind of a different way of measuring the file than it is just exporting it out as a static image. So we're going to actually manually kind of scale this up to match this one. So when you're happy with that, just right click, print, make sure the scale's right, and we're just printing that to a PDF. I'm just going to put that on the desktop as well. So that's the second element we're saving out. Back to my view, make sure it's on. And the third element we're going to get out is a rendered view of this file. Now if I go to render, we can do a quick preview of this to see what it's currently looking like. So I'm just going to hit my render preview, export that out. So we have a sunlight previously set up from the file, and you can kind of see that on the edge here as its preview comes out. But we can also see that this is really sort of bright and a bit kind of over bright there, so we might want to play around with the gamma levels to get that working. And I'd say that I've got a kind of too strong sun in there. So what we're going to need to do is we need to go back and change the lighting levels in this file so they're a bit more kind of accurate to what I'm doing. So much like before, I'll just go into render and render properties here, and we can change the resolution, which will change just before we do the final render to match our screen capture resolution we did before. But first we're just going to change the sun settings, and I'm going to have a play around with these. We've kind of covered those in the previous session, so I'll do a quick kind of overview of those to show you sort of how they work again, but we're not going to be spending too long on the sun settings in this lesson. Now for this render as well, I actually am going to turn off this option called the skylight, and this adds like an ambient light to your scene, but because I want quite strong shadows, which I'm then going to be overlaying on my image in Photoshop, I actually want to turn off that skylight. So we just have our sun working on the image. Now what that does is if I go OK and back to render preview, you'll see now that I've got a much stronger shadow coming in, and it's a lot quicker to render as well. It hasn't got that kind of overall ambient lighting on here, and we can kind of play around with the strength of that shadow. But I actually want it to be quite contrasty because we're going to be using it as an overlay, basically, as this kind of shadow file, which we're then going to be combining with our other layers in our image. So I kind of like what the shadows are doing here, but I'm going to have a quick play around to see if we can get some more dynamic shadows working on this building first. So to play around with those shadows, I'm just going to go back to render properties, back to my sun settings, and just I'm going to just change the angles of the sun here and change the direction. It's just a kind of case of tweaking the angle, the direction, hitting OK, going back to your render preview and testing it again, and trying to get it until you sort of get some dynamic lighting and lighting that you kind of think's working on your building. A good rule of thumb is to kind of imagine that the lighting's coming over your left or right shoulder, and that usually gives you quite dynamic shadows. You don't want the face of the building in complete shadow, and you don't want it in complete bright light as well. You want to kind of balance between the two. So it's a case of trying to match that up. So I'm going to pause the video and have a quick play with the lighting until we get it correct. So I've now got the lighting at a kind of right level that I'm happy with. We've got some nice kind of shadows working on these balconies here and these walkways, but we've also got a kind of good contrast between the light side of the building and the dark side here, and then these layers at the front. Now this particular render we're setting up here is going to be what's called our shadow layer, and we're going to use it to overlay on top of our image to give us some good contrasting shadows. So I'm not going to set kind of any different colours for the windows or for the water at the moment. We're just going to render this out as a basic shadow layer on top. So when you're happy with the lighting is set up correctly, we're then going to run the full render. So we're first going to set the resolution and quality, and we're going to want to match that to the previous one we set up for our capture. So we're going to lock it to the viewport aspect again, and we're going to go 4000 by 2539, which was the same as the capture I set out. And when you're happy with that, we'll go OK, and then we're going to run the render. Now this will probably take a little bit of time to run out, so we're going to start it, and then we're just going to let it run, and I'm going to pause the video while that renders out as well. But because we haven't got that kind of skylight on as well, it's just the sun we're using, it's actually a lot quicker than if you have that other lighting turned on, because we haven't got any kind of ambient lighting in the scene, it's just shadow and light. So actually it's not going too slowly here on this machine. You can see this rendering out, and because we've got that much higher resolution, you'll see when you zoom in it's actually quite accurate what is being rendered, and we're getting kind of bits of geometry that are casting different shadows there. You can see the kind of different levels of the building, so this is quite an accurate shadow layer we've got, which is perfect. So this is now finished rendering, and you'll see we've got a good shadow, we've got a nice bit of contrast. You can always play around with the gamma levels if you want to tweak that as well. It might be that some parts are too dark, some parts are too bright. The kind of trick with this image is you want a good contrast between the darkest part of the image and the brightest part. So it's trying to find a kind of balance in between. We can always adjust that a bit in Photoshop, but it's good to sort of save out a good contrasting image. So I'm quite happy with that. I might do it a little bit darker. Let's go about there. So there we've got a kind of light side that is clearly contrasting the darker side of the image, and the shadows are much, much darker than everything else. So that's perfect, that's exactly what we want. So when you're happy with that, we're going to save, and we're just going to save it out as a JPEG, and we're going to call this shadows. Now also in the Rhino render we can render out what's called an alpha channel, which is basically a black and white image which allows us to cut out the background of our building. And if you click on this icon here, you can there see we've got all our geometry is white and our background is black, and this is really helpful in Photoshop to help chop out our building later down the line. So we're just going to save this out as well. So with those two saved, that's now our shadow layer done. We're now going to try and set up a kind of ambient render layer as well, which we're also going to be rendering out. Now to do that, I'm just going to close my render preview. I'm going to go back onto render properties, and we're going to turn off the sunlight because we've got our shadow layer, and we're going to turn back on the skylight, which is that kind of ambient lighting that the scene is given. If I do a quick preview of that to show you what that looks like. Just wait for that to load up. It's still quite contrasty. I think I haven't quite set the sun off correctly. Just go and check that. So now that sun should be turned off properly. Let's try that again. So that was just switching off the sunlight and turning on that skylight. Now you'll see it's a lot slower to render out because the skylight kind of renders this ambient lighting, which is a lot harder for the computer to compute. And you'll see it's usually a little bit grainy as well, and that's just the kind of nature of using that lighting system because it gives a kind of overall light, not a strong shadow. It's a bit more difficult for the computer to work out, so renders a little bit slower. But what we're going to be doing is we're going to be adding some glass surface onto here, and we're going to be adding a reflection in the water as well. And we're going to be using these later down the line to help us kind of play up the reflections in both those materials there. So that's kind of rendering out. So we've seen the preview. Now we're going to do some basic material setup in the Rhino render. Now this is quite a kind of extended topic and you can go into in quite a lot of detail. We're going to be covering it in quite a basic sense in this session, but we may go on to it in a bit more detail at a later date. And it's interesting to have a look into yourself. But obviously if you're using a different render engine, if you have kind of V-Ray on Rhino or something else, it's a similar method to that. So to set up basic materials for the glass and the water, we're going to go to Render, open up our material editor here, which is just on this right hand side by our properties layer, and you'll see it kind of has a basic materials set up there, but we're going to click on this plus and we're going to create a custom material. Now I think in your own time it's probably good to have a go through and see what each of these different materials are, but for now we're just going to set up a basic custom material. We're going to call this water. Actually, we're just going to call this reflective because the idea of this material is all we want is to show the reflection of the building in this kind of piece of water here and the reflection of the building in on itself in the glass on the building. So we're not going to be adding any colours to it. It's only going to be a reflection layer, and we're going to use that to overlay in Photoshop. So we're just setting up a very basic material at this stage. So call it reflective. And then in the settings here, the only setting you need to worry about is this reflectivity here, and we're just going to ramp that up to 100%. And you can see kind of in the little preview, it sort of looks like a metal here, like a shiny mirror surface, and that's exactly what we want. So that's all we're going to do to the material. Like I said, it's good to have a play around with some of these, and we might be going back at a later stage to have a look at different material settings, but for the time being we're just going to set up a very simple reflective material. I'm going to right click and we're going to assign it to layers. Because we've set up a window layer and a water layer already with those objects in, we only have to tick on those two layers there, hit OK, and those objects are, that material is then assigned to those objects in the layers. We can always go to rendered view to kind of see, and you can see that it's not perfectly rendered out the building because that takes too much just in this preview, but you can see that these windows are starting to reflect slightly the things that are next door to them. So when we're happy with that, we're just going to go back to render and render preview and let that load up. You'll see now that these reflections are coming through quite nicely. So we've got some reflections on the building in the windows there, and also in this kind of pool of water in front. Now it might be that you want to add distortions to the water so it looks like it's rippling. We can do that in Photoshop, or we can do that in the render as well. I won't be going over in this lesson how to do it in the render, but I think later down the line I can show you how to do that too. but it's just playing around with these texture settings here. And if you assign a bump texture, bump basically describes the kind of roughness or the surface finish of the object, so you can apply that to the material to give it a slightly kind of wavy texture, much like water, that way. So we'll just wait for that to finish rendering out. So I can now see from my preview that that's kind of rendering out as I wanted to. So now we know that, we can stop this one and we can render out the final image for this last element of our render, which we're going to be rendering out. Render and let that go. So I'm going to pause the video and let that render out now. So that render took quite a bit longer to render out. That took about an hour and a bit to get all this kind of rendered. So I've paused it now because we don't need this landscape or the landscape here rendered in. All we really needed from this view was the reflection in the water and the reflection in the windows there. So now I've done that, I'm going to save that one out as well. Just call it reflection. And now we have all our elements of our image saved. So we've got the capture here, which is just the base color on the render, the reflection layer with just the areas which are being reflected, and the shadows. And we're going to combine all these together in Photoshop in the next lesson, start to look at how to kind of work this up into an actual image of the building. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next lesson.